about what's going on with this project. Scott? Are you good to go? I'm Todd Messenger. I'm a zoning consultant. I work for a national firm that helps cities and counties all over the country do their planning and their zoning, try to figure out how to make sense of zoning, because what happens is, and we'll show you over time, people, the local governments enact zoning codes, and then over time they amend them, and they amend them, and they amend them. And after a certain number of amendments, nobody can make sense of what the thing was in the first place. And at that point, it's time to scrap them and rebuild them from scratch. And that's what we do. And it happens often enough that we actually can form a company and help cities and counties all over the country do that. And so my background is, I got a law degree back in 2000, and I was a land use lawyer for the private sector for 6 years. Now, we did some representation of local governments, but mostly we helped developers get things done, mostly redeveloping property where neighbor issues were pretty significant. So I understand from the developer side, but I also represented some neighbors, so I understand from the neighbor side. I also represented some civic groups, so I understand from the civic group side, and I also represented local governments. So it puts me in the unique position of having litigated on behalf of all these different entities and knowing where the middle ground is, and knowing that finding the middle ground is itself a very difficult thing to do. And so coming in with all due humility to a project in an environment as diverse as Kootenai County, as passionate as Kootenai County, and with as many different viewpoints as people in Kootenai County have, finding out where that middle ground is one heck of a task, I can assure you. But that's what we're here to do. Kootenai County right now has about 30 ordinances that relate to land development. How many people in the room have had the good fortune to read them all? Okay, don't. Okay, there's a reason that we're scrapping those ordinances. They're very difficult to reconcile. But right now, you should know that the existing condition is that the entire county is zoned, and there are ordinances that have to do land development all over the place. And within those ordinances, some of the rules don't make very much sense, and we had committee meetings today where we went through that, the recordings of public records. And so we're trying to make sense of something that's very, very, very difficult. The good news is that we have a lot of people in the county who have volunteered their time to help us through this process to make sure it's shaped in a way that's appropriate for Kootenai County. Because what we do know is that Kootenai County is a special place. One need only look around during the day or even at night in parts of the county where you have starlight at night to know how special a place this is. And so a prescription for zoning that would maybe work somewhere else in the country won't work here. And we come in humble enough to know that we don't have answers for the county until we ask the county what its issues are. So just that by way of introduction, that's philosophically where we are. So I'm Todd. I'm here to help. I'm from the private sector. Your ordinances are broken. We're here to help fix them. And we'll talk about all that stuff that you'd like to talk about after our first hour of presentation. Maybe we get through it a little bit faster. So what I want to be able to do tonight is we'll introduce a topic of procedure. In other words, how do I get stuff done in the county if I want to get something approved on my property? Or do I even need an approval at all? Because in many cases, you don't. And we'll talk about nonconformities, which are, well, you got a whole bunch of new law that's coming into place. What about my property now? And what's going to happen to my property? What am I going to be asked to do or not do, and when? And, the good news is nothing unless you want to build something, in which case we'll talk about what those procedures are. So your use of your property now, no matter what your district is, you're going to be continuing to do whatever you do now. I'm from the perspective, having represented all these sides, that the overreach into people's personal business is not what I want to be involved in. So I'm not exactly a hardcore libertarian, but I'm not exactly not. Okay? So I would not want people to reach into my business, and I don't want people to reach into other people's business either. So those things are important values to me, and I think that was probably one of the reasons why we were selected from a bunch of different highly qualified consulting teams to do this work on behalf of the county. So anyway, procedures and nonconformities. Tonight, the program will be, we'll talk some background, and I've covered a little bit of that ground, but we'll cover a little bit more. Then we'll talk about what we put in quotes as nonconformities, because I don't think that people use this term nonconformities too much in their daily life, and I think it's very misunderstood out there. A lot of us call it grandfathering, but we'll talk to you about how we should treat our grandfathers better than the current code treats grandfathered property, and how we can do that and will do that in the proposed new code, at least as we would recommend it. Then we'll talk about procedures in a fairly general fashion and how we're trying to straighten out procedures that really don't make a lot of sense to us right now as detached third-party observers. And when we make those observations to people that we're working with on our committees and so forth, they agree, why are we doing some of the things that we're doing now? And how can we make that better? And to that end as well, I'm a dedicated student of the Constitution and due process, and having litigated due process issues for 6 years, because land use lawyers are constitutional lawyers by their very nature.
Yeah, right.
I know a fair bit about it, and there's some opinions, reported opinions with my name on them as counsel of record, where we've litigated some of these issues in another state. But they are federal constitutional issues, and I'm very, very sensitive. I have sworn to uphold the Constitution in 2 states. Idaho's not one of them, but I take it seriously everywhere I am, just so you know. And so that's a very serious obligation of mine. And then an open question and answer session, like I promised. I know that there's a lot more heat than light on this project right now in the community. I know that the Board of County Commissioners have recently issued a press release, which is available in the back of the room. If you don't have it, I recommend it. That addresses some of the points that have been lodged against the process. And so that everybody knows, a lot of those points were lodged against the process before even a word of the project was actually written. So there would be no way to know in advance what we were actually doing when we were accused of reaching in and taking.
No, I'm not standing record. Thanks, though.
Just not what we're up to. So in any case, background. The natural progression of law, and as a student of law, I learned this right away, and as a person who's involved in the reform of laws to make them make sense, I have observed this in 100% of cases that I've been involved in, is towards disorder. So in other words, we have a good idea, we pass a law. The bill becomes a law through a legislative process in our republic, and then after time we realize, well, here's a unique situation for which that law doesn't work, so we need to amend it. So we amend it, and then in due course something else comes up, and we amend it again, and again, and again, and again. Your ordinances haven't been comprehensively revisited in quite some time. So that original foundation of good idea is now completely lost in the amendments. And your whole thing is covered in Band-Aids. Now, realistically, zoning is a collection of wisdom and favors and mistakes. So sometimes we have wisdom, we have a good idea, we do a good job writing an ordinance to address that situation. Sometimes there's somebody who gets political favor, it happens, your code has some of that in it. And then sometimes there's just a mistake. You know, we tried to do something, we did it fast, it was in reaction to something, we think it solved it, and it screwed it up. And so we need to go through and figure out, okay, where's the wisdom? What do we want to keep? What do we want to bring forward? And where's the stuff that just is garbage now in the 21st century that just needs to go and be revisited in another way that makes more sense? And generally in the direction of how can we just take away layers of regulations that just no longer have any useful purpose, but just trip people up on day-to-day activities. So basically these things come up, they lead to inconsistency and uncertainty, and the current regulations now are just outmoded and broken. And I think are there builders in the room or developers that have tried to use this stuff, lawyers who are just frustrated by it on a regular basis? Okay, we got a couple hands coming up. So they understand the need to have something more predictable, more timely, and more standards-based. I work for a number of developers, and the developer said to me, look, I don't care what the rules are. I just want to be able to sit at my desk and figure out how I can do a project within those rules, and if it doesn't pencil, I'm not going to do it. But at least I haven't put anything at risk other than, half a day of work trying to figure out whether I can do something. And they would much prefer that to designing a project and going through public hearings and $250,000 later realizing, oh, I got to know. And by I got to know, it doesn't mean I got to know something. It means I got a no as an answer to my request to do something after investing a $250,000 bet because the standards weren't clear enough and somebody had a device by which they could deny an application. If you're an opponent, how many have opposed a project next door at some time or other? And you know that there are discretionary standards by which triggers can be pulled to basically assassinate a project. And those are, if there's a reference, okay, is it consistent with the comprehensive plan? Have you read the comprehensive plan? How many have gone through the comprehensive plan? Now, how many can give me a principled analytical technique by which you could evaluate whether something's consistent with the comprehensive plan? Any takers?
Gold.
Takers?
Silver.
Thank you for being honest. How many have pulled that trigger anyway? Oh, come on. Nobody? All right, in other communities there would have been more hands. But that's fair enough. In any case, you can't evaluate that. You can't reasonably evaluate that. This new code would say if it's consistent with the code is consistent with the comprehensive plan, ergo, it's consistent with the comprehensive plan. So many standards in the codes are ambiguous or difficult to find. Anybody know how to build an accessory dwelling unit in Kootenai County? You know where the standards are? Where? An accessory dwelling unit, which is sort of the granny flat. It's the unit above the garage. Does anybody watch Happy Days back in the days? It's where the Fonz lived. See, I'm dating myself, but you probably remember watching that too. In any case, that's the accessory dwelling unit. It's not exactly a duplex, but it's some small unit on the property. And right now, the Kootenai County zoning ordinance has a definition for accessory dwelling unit in which all the standards for building an accessory dwelling unit are incorporated. So if you were looking somewhere else other than the definitions, which nobody ever reads, you wouldn't even know that they address accessory dwelling unit in the code. So if you had a printed copy, you will totally miss it, I promise you, unless you read it page by page. It is actually, since it's begins with A. That's how I got it. In any case, people who want to build things or start new businesses that have to struggle with 30 different ordinances to see what applies, kudos for doing it, but it's very difficult to do on both sides. So that breeds mistrust of government because the government has lots that it doesn't understand either, and they're doing the best they can. So in good faith, people can come to different ideas about what the law actually says. The law should be rather clear when it comes to dealing with what people want to do on their real estate. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I don't need a show of hands for that. Current procedures are complicated without providing real benefits in terms of quality. If I have to jump through a flaming hoop to get an approval for a site, for development of something, then that should create some tremendous value in terms of the quality of what I do. I hope nobody disagrees with that. And so the procedures should reflect every procedure that the government puts in place should generate some kind of value or real protection, and not just be somebody making a call that, by all rights, if it's not adding anything, it just shouldn't be there. So procedures should be streamlined, but where things are really complicated, or where the legislature in its infinite wisdom has told us that we have to have a procedure, the county is a creature of the state. It has to follow the statutes. But where the county gets to choose, it should have as little procedure as it needs to ensure the quality of that development. And that's really all there is to the philosophy. So this is my humorous comparison, which we talked about as a preview. This is the evolution of law. And if anybody played Jenga? Okay. So Jenga is a game where you start with 3 in each stack, and you have to pull one out and put it on the top. And you keep doing that until it falls. And whoever puts the last one on and it falls loses. But that's how codes evolve until nobody can make sense of it anymore. You keep amending it. You change this and put it on top. Change this and put it on top. Pretty soon there's no foundation left and it collapses on itself. And so you get called in to fix it. You got all this stuff to work with. Some of those blocks you throw out. Some of them you hollow down. You rebuild the tower in something that you hope lasts longer because it reflects the values of the people that live in the community. So for us, our job, which I can promise you isn't very easy to do, so with all humility, I hope you'll accept that, is to figure out what the will of the community is with respect to land use. With the understanding that not only are we all property owners, or if you're not, you're a potential property owner or a renter or something. I imagine everybody here either resides in or does substantial business in the town. Otherwise, kudos for being involved in something regional. Because of that level, we need to make sure that we have it right for everybody. So every so often it's time for the complete overhaul. This is what we just said. We're here to help. That's what we do. And we're here to reflect something that reflects you. Because a prescription from somewhere else, if I wrote this from my desk, it wouldn't be useful. But if I go to a meeting like this, and I'm sure I'll hear a lot of stuff in the second hour, and maybe some questions and comments in the first hour, that's the kind of stuff that we use to shape it. So nonconformities. Nonconformities are what happens to what's there when the new code comes. Well, the first thing that everybody needs to understand about zoning, how many people are just a homeowner in Kootenai County that are concerned about what this is going to be doing? Okay, how many people live in an incorporated city? Okay, so the first order of business is if you live in an incorporated city, then it's the city zoning that affects you directly. Your house is under city zoning. And so if you live in Post Falls or Coeur d'Alene or somewhere else, that the county has zero jurisdiction in terms of zoning there. The sheriff has jurisdiction over everything in the county, but the land use decisions are made in the cities for the cities. How many have a business in the county on which they own the real estate where the business is located? Okay, just a few fewer, but plenty, that's good. You want business owners in the room. So with respect to homeowners, we have something that eliminates nonconformities. So many of you, how many of you checked the zoning of where you live before you bought your house? That's more than I would expect. Most people don't. But it's fewer than people who are homeowners. So if you didn't raise your hand, probably not a big deal, because generally speaking, zoning is very protective of existing homeowners. The current code is rather protective. The new code is even more protective. But unless you ask for some kind of change, if you're going to scrape your house and rebuild it or whatever, zoning is not all that relevant to a homeowner. Nobody's going to tell you you can't hang a basketball hoop above your garage or have a barbecue or have your church group over on whatever night you want. Nobody's going to do that through zoning, and nobody's going to do that anyway, because frankly, those are neighbor fights, if anything, and they're certainly not something that a local government has the time or the resources to get involved in. And I know of no local government that's interested in that, and if you've got one, then point it out to me, because I'd love to hear the anecdote. I don't think it's Kootenai County. Okay, Santa Clara County. Yeah, that's probably California. Yeah, okay, well, California is another instance. Any Californians in the room? All right, I'll admit to being a Floridian if you're never been to California. That's okay. Florida gets into some of that stuff too, but only in certain exclusive enclaves. All right, so again, nonconformities, one of the first orders of business is, in creating a new zoning code for Kootenai County, is that there's really, one of our participants suggested that the culture can be summed up in, it's okay for us to throw our elbows around, and it's even okay for us to make a little bit of contact, as long as we don't knock anybody out. Is that where this room is?
No.
Okay.
Basically, it's my property, leave it alone.
Okay, so you throw your
Amen.
elbows and knock your neighbor out.
No, it's not what liberty is.
Okay, that's what we're talking about. Like, as a neighbor, if your neighbor does something a little bit obnoxious, that's okay. But if your neighbor opens a concrete plant on 1 acre in the middle of a residential neighborhood, less okay. Is that where we are?
It's not what we meant.
Met Black?
As long as they don't open a meth lab, do something illegal, we're good.
Okay.
His property is good.
Okay, well, there are certain
Amen.
districts in which lots and lots of things are allowed, and maybe there are certain areas where we should take that into account. There are a variety of different ways that these things can be handled, and we appreciate all the comments, and we'll talk about those. In any case, the nonconformities provisions, homeowners as a philosophical point should never have to worry about regulatory overreach. In other words, the basketball court, all the different things we do with our homes that, if you have enough land, you set up a target, you shoot your guns or whatever, it's all good. We don't need to reach into somebody's castle. We don't want to reach into somebody's castle. And if you have an existing home, you ought to have a lot of opportunity to expand and improve on your property. Improvements to property are good. Everybody benefits from that. Everybody gets lifted when one guy in the neighborhood does something good with their house. Unnecessary costs, we're all cost conscious, and the government should be cost conscious about what the regulations mean to homeowners. It's the people of Kootenai County that make Kootenai County what it is. And then homeowners shouldn't have to worry about, in quotes, nonconformity, which is really, is the bank going to be upset if the house burns down and I can't rebuild it? That's really what that boils down to. We need to protect you as against your lender's nervousness if you have a mortgage. Does anybody in the room have a mortgage or a refi or anything like that? Who knows? Awesome. All right. That's security. That's first order of business, security as against your lender. EN zone. So what we did was we created a zone called established neighborhoods. If anybody had been following us for a long time, how many people have been with us since the beginning or early on in this process? You might have heard this as neighborhood conservation.
Oh.
Had the wrong connotation to it. We're not trying to have conservation in neighborhoods. We're trying to conserve neighborhoods, which established neighborhoods was a better way of phrasing it that made more sense. So we call it established neighborhood, or EN.
Same thing,
And
different.
in an EN zone, the house that you have, which may in many instances predate any zoning ordinance at all, is conforming. Bang. So right now, your house may be non-conforming. You may or may not know whether it's non-conforming. Does anybody know that they have a non-conforming house, say in the agriculture suburban zone or something like that? Any non-conformities in the room? It doesn't mean you're a non-conformist, although I suspect that we may have non-conformists in the room too. All right, well, there's a bunch of non-conformities out there in the landscape. We know that because the code has been amended a bunch of times, and you don't have to, and nobody does, go through all of the properties and measure them with a ruler to make sure everything is conforming. So what we say is, what you've got conforms. The law will recognize that what's already there is good. And in most cases in a residential neighborhood, it's not hurting anybody. It's okay. So there's room to expand. there are standards that relate to cover and things like that, height, setbacks. And if you want to go beyond those standards, there are ways to do that without coming in and asking for a variance.
Like what?
Oh, there's a bunch of standards in the code. We can go through them in more detail. But basically, let me just say what it is now. Let's say you have a 10-foot setback line, okay? And your house is at 10 and you want to build a bathroom. Under the current ordinances, you have to go and ask a hearing officer for a variance and prove that you have a hardship if you don't have a bathroom on your house. Now, that doesn't make any sense. If you can build that addition without hurting anybody, you should be able to build the addition without asking in a public hearing, oh, please, hearing officer, can I have a new bathroom on my house?
Aren't there 5 things that make them a variance, and you have to meet at least 2 of those 5 in order to get a variance?
The key one, sir, is hardship. You know, everything else gets subsumed by it, you know? And so, yeah, there are a few things under Idaho law that justify the granting of the variance. And the reality is that you can't meet it in respect to a bathroom. But the reality also is that unless there are neighbors there with pitchforks and torches, you'll get your variance. But you shouldn't have to ask that at a public hearing. You should be able to just demonstrate, hey, here are some ways that this really doesn't affect the neighbors. And then somebody from the department should just give you a building permit quickly. Why should you have to wait?
That takes, what, 6 months before you can actually get the variance even heard, and you may or may not have to hire an attorney unless you want to do it yourself, right?
Thank you. For a bathroom. It doesn't make any sense, does it?
That's affirmative. That's what the case is right now.
That's the case right now, exactly. The case under the new code wouldn't be like that. It wouldn't be like that. It'd be much easier to do. Very easy standards to meet, and boom, staff approval of a permit for a building without a variance. So not only do you not have to have this variance traveling along in your chain of title to show that it's okay to have what you have, the code will just say, here it is, it's okay. You were approved for that because you met the standards in the code, like everything else. You're conforming. So the regulations are limited. There's not a whole bunch of additional overreach in here. The state says that you have to have setbacks and height addressed in your code, so we have that. But beyond that, if you want to push against the setback and go past it, you can do it, like we said. So the numbers are there. If you comply with the numbers, go get your permit. If you don't, you show a little bit extra, not much, and you go get your permit. Now those things are up on the web, and we'll give you a web address for how to look at them. And if you have any comments about other ways that you should be able to get to yes, we'll put them in. So the idea here is we want to create a whole bunch of ways to get to yes that we know everybody will accept, instead of a whole bunch of ways to get to no, or one linchpin way to get to know, like, is it consistent with the comprehensive plan? Where somebody can just say no, and they don't have to explain themselves, because you can say yes or no like flipping a coin on a standard like that. It doesn't make any sense. So I appreciate the comment, sir. Variances are no way to deal with a bathroom on a single-family home or a small expansion.
Whereabouts in
reasonable
the new
expansion.
plan is that located, so you don't have to have a variance?
I'm sorry?
Whereabouts specifically, what chapter and code is it in the new plan where that alleviates the need for variance?
So the question is, where is it in the new code
Yes, you
that
said-
alleviates the requirement to go and get a variance?
That's correct.
So the answer is there's an article in there called Established Neighborhoods. And in that article, and we'll, I think, we'll have to do a little bit better job in that article of explaining how it works. But in that article, you have a table that says these are the setbacks in the zone. And after that table, it says, if you can't meet the setbacks, that's okay. Here are a bunch of different ways to go past the setback, closer to your lot lines than you are. And you can get permits that way too. So it's an alternative. You can do this alternative or that alternative without a
So
variance.
it's definitively in there right now.
Right now.
If we go on and look, you'll
EN,
definitely see
yes. I think it's Article 3.4, but it might be 3.5. It's in Article 3 in the code now. It was called Neighborhood Conservation before. We published it again with the EN instead of NC. It's the same concept.
Sounds better,
Right.
doesn't it?
What's that?
Sounds better, it's easier to swallow.
In terms of swallowing it or not, we think if it's more descriptive, it's better. That's where we come from. If it's a
Baloney.
better fit for the vocabulary, people understand it, that's what we count on. Okay, so we're not trying to conserve resources. Again, we're trying to conserve neighborhoods. People and homes and their castles, we're trying to allow for easier investments without variances. Because all over the country, anywhere there's a zoning code, setbacks, if you don't meet the setbacks, you get a variance. And 99 times out of 100, the variance is granted. But that homeowner had to jump through a flaming hoop. How many are comfortable coming to a public hearing and asking for something? Is it fair? Yeah, good. I can tell. Not too many. Why should you have to do what I do and just talk in front of a group of people about what it is that you want to do? Just put it on the paper and say, okay, it's reasonable. And staff would say, yeah, you go do it. Okay, so this is an aside on the EN zone because there's been a lot of information out there and a lot of it is either inaccurate or incomplete. So there was this notion that 90% of a lot over 5 acres would have to be dedicated to open space. All right, let's just take the 10-acre example, all right? How many know how many square feet in an acre?
43,560.
43,560. So in 10 acres, 443,560, 435,000, right? So we're talking about a lot of dirt, which means 10% of that is 1 acre, 43,560 square feet. At ground level, could be impervious cover. This is a house near Manalapan, Florida. It's a big house. The only way I could get this picture is across a big lake, okay? Because I can't get close to it to take a picture that'll fit in the frame up of that camera, the 52mm lens if you're a photographer. It's a big honking house. It is, in the property record, 16,305 square feet. That house, and then a couple others, would fit in 43,560 square foot of cover. I can tell you that 10% coverage in a residential application on a 10-acre lot is more than enough to accommodate anywhere your market is today and tomorrow and the next day. And the next day, if it's even bigger than that, you can amend the ordinance. It's not fixed in stone throughout history. We don't write these things on stone tablets.
Put 4 barns up, you shouldn't, why should I have to worry about a 10% coverage?
In terms of the established neighborhood district, or even in terms of other districts that have the lot covered, you have open space requirements now, but they include parking, which doesn't make any sense. Does anybody consider a parking lot open space? Why have an open space requirement, right? It's about where the water goes.
That's the big question right there.
Yeah.
We have one.
Well, I can tell you, the reason to have one is it's about where the water goes, right? Water wants to go either into the ground or off into a stream. And if you have a big parking lot, it's about where the water goes. But let me answer the more general questions after I get to procedure, because I promised I would do that. And we can talk about the philosophical underpinnings. But again, this home is 16,305. If you had a couple barns, you could do a lot on 43,560 square feet of dirt.
Is that footprint?
No, it's not.
So it's not 16,000 square foot footprint?
It is not, although some of those areas that look like 2 stories, I can't imagine that this is not a 2-story without a ceiling.
So you
Because
have
that's how
more
this house is
space,
built.
you have more space to use.
More space. 43,560 square feet, if it were just homes, would be a home that had 2 acres under roof.
So if that's 10,000. Right.
Probably about.
Yeah, it's bigger than 8,000 on the ground. The tax assessor in Palm Beach County underestimates a little bit for a variety of different reasons, but that's a big. And it extends into the lot too, the other direction, in a fairly substantial way. In any case, it's just by illustration. We're talking about a large amount of land when you talk about 10% of a 5 or a 10-acre piece of property. And as we get down into smaller lots, there's a lot more area on that lot to build, because we're not going to shrink it down in proportion to make sense. So in other words, other existing development should move towards compliance. So if you're not an established neighborhood, like a house, single-family homeowner, but you're a business or an industrial facility or an institutional facility or whatever, but not a farmer, because farmers are pretty much exempt from all this stuff. Farmers, state law protects you. We are not interfering with farming operations that utilize farming methods that are protected by the state. Foresters, we do not have jurisdiction. Idaho Department of Lands, you all know the Idaho Forest Practices Act? That's what we talk about with respect to regulating forestry. Not anything to do with the county. The county has to totally defer on issues of forestry to the Idaho Department of Lands. Subdividing the forestry land, that there's a changeover there. But in terms of your activities as farmers and foresters, again, totally exempt from this stuff. We have districts that help protect your interests, but you're exempt from zoning.
Todd, you don't mean that they're exempted in relation to their residents on their farm or in the forest?
No, the activities of farming and forestry. I hope I was very clear about that, because that's what I said. The residential aspects of it will be, you're not going to get above 10% of these larger lots with your house, as far as we've seen, even close to that, as far as we've seen on the maps that we've looked at. And if you've got a house on a forestry parcel that's of some size, that's larger than 10% of that parcel, come see me and we'll make appropriate adjustments to make sure we've accommodated it. But I haven't seen anything like that. And we've done extensive looks at the aerials to make sure that we were calibrating this in a way that made sense and that offered plenty of opportunity for growth. from what's there. Sir?
Now, are you gonna change the zoning in these different areas, or are you gonna leave the zoning alone?
Right, so basically what we found out as we looked at the zoning as it is now, is that it didn't make any sense. The zoning districts that you have now are not reflective of what you do in the county. The agriculture and the rural districts are the same, which is most of the county. How many live in a rural district? How many live in an agricultural district? You know what the difference is? Show me the agricultural district again. Does anybody know what the fundamental difference is? Can't subdivide. Exactly. Did everybody else know that? Can't subdivide? Are you kidding me? So, let's see, who has 160 acres or more? In an agricultural district? Rural district?
Just rural.
Okay. If you have, say, who has 40 acres or more in an ag district? Who has 80 acres or more in an ag district? Does it bother you that you can't cut up 80 acres?
Well, yeah.
Okay?
Suppose
You
you got
should.
80 acres and you want to subdivide.
Under the new code, you'd be able to. You'd be able to. It wouldn't be a lot of
Well, you
subdivision.
said that you can
But you
develop
be able
leave
to.
90% of it undeveloped. So you can't get the density on there to pay for the infrastructure that you gotta have a development.
But there's a couple of things. One is the new code reduces the cost of infrastructure and lower density projects. And two, you'd be able to carve off pieces for family members and small things before you rezoned it for some higher intensity development. So not only could you take it, but you could continue farming and cleave off a couple of lots to sell to buy seed the next year in hard times. These are important factors. I mean, some people would depend upon that from time to time to be able to do that. And we don't have a code provision now that allows that. To us, coming in from the outside, that doesn't make any sense. Density numbers could be here or there, but saying that what you have now in agriculture is all you're ever going to have in that district, it doesn't make sense to us. It's an overreach. We believe that it's an overreach. Maybe you do too. The new code would be finished and put up for some kind of adoption sometime early next year is the schedule for it. So, pretty soon now, we would have a program where subdivision would be possible where it's not possible now. Yes, ma'am.
So what happens in a rural district, where we can now divide into fives?
Right.
Will we still be able to divide into fives, or are you gonna tell us we can only do 10s or 20s now?
So rural districts right now, there's a lot of different things that could happen. The rural district goes away, it's replaced by a state residential district. So if you don't have a developed lot and there's a bunch of 5-acre lots next to each other and none of them are developed, the estate residential district is the 5-acre district. Now, what we've seen on the ground is most of the 5-acre lots have houses on them, or they're surrounded by lots that have houses on them. So that becomes an established neighborhood district. So those homeowners don't have to deal with non-conforming situations, which we'll get into in greater detail after we get past philosophy. So basically, the rezone will be, is if you live in a neighborhood of 5-acre lots, you'll be in a district called EN5, which will say it's a 5-acre lot neighborhood. And that if you have a home there, there are lots of opportunities to expand it without variances. And you can do your agricultural and have 4-H animals and all kinds of stuff there. But, it's a neighborhood. We'll respect it as a neighborhood rather than a rural district. In fact, a 5-acre lot neighborhood isn't very rural. It's more of an estate district. Sir?
In a prior meeting, you mentioned a tier system, that if you were adjoining a city, you could subdivide. And if you lived in the adjoining tiers as you move further out, there would be no subdivision, but you just said you could subdivide. Could you clarify or rectify your two statements?
Yes. Originally, we had been trying to figure out, there's an area of the county in the Rathdrum Prairie that's currently in what's called the shared tier area of city impact. And then all of the different cities have their own areas of city impact that are closer to the cities. And so does anybody know about areas of city impact? I want to give you a little background, or if you don't. Okay. I'm going to give you a little background, and I'm going to have to fill it in so that everybody knows where the question comes from. Okay? So basically, under Idaho law right now, you've got an area of city impact that the city and the counties negotiate what that area is, and then what plan and what land development regulations will apply there. And so this is sort of related to procedure. That's why I'm covering it now. And that is that moving on. In the area of city impact, they have to do that. So you have these agreements in place now, which means over large areas of the Rathdrum Prairie, you can't do any subdivision at all under the current regime. So we had different ideas about how to change that, and right now we're at a place where annexation into the city, if you want to develop at high density, is what what's going to happen for high-density stuff where you need sewers, and we want to have that voluntary annexation. And then subdivision in a more limited capacity would be available across the shared tier. With the smaller lots, the better. And that would come with an agreement that when you go to subdivide the cities there and you want to turn that into a bigger neighborhood of smaller lots, that you would annex that neighborhood in to get sewer. So that would be an opportunity for a short-term economic return and then a longer term, where right now you would have to wait for the city to come in order to do anything other than agriculture on that property. Okay, real quick, is it related to procedure?
It's related to the aquifer, and wasn't that why they weren't allowing divisions on that land now?
Yes, but we have talked to the cities and Panhandle Health and come to a solution that allows more flexibility for landowners rather than less. And so we go in the pursuit of more flexibility rather than less.
So they're not concerned about that?
They are very concerned about the aquifer, so we're talking about low-density subdivisions, but we're not talking about saying no, 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 when there is some accommodation that the aquifer can have. So it's a balanced approach that allows more flexibility for an owner, but is still protective of the aquifer. It follows the 5-acre rule, but it allows it on smaller lots with community septic. It's further detailed. But in any case, we are moving in the direction of more flexibility with keeping the resource protection things in mind. Standards for bringing property into compliance ought to be refined to deal with the challenges that people actually face. So we want to move towards compliance, but we don't want to make compliance disincentivized by the code. Standards should relate to actual living experiences. Here's an example. The current non-conforming use requirements are not especially nice to grandpa. So if you have a grandfather notion in mind that I can do anything I want because I was doing it, that's not what the regulations currently say. There's no expansion of the use in terms of hours of operation, floor area, traffic, value of goods handled, or number of dwelling units. So if you have what's called a non-conforming use now, you can't really grow that business or that residential use. No resuming the use after 12 months of abandonment, or if you convert it to a use that's allowed in the district. So if you have grandpa there, if grandpa leaves the room, grandpa doesn't come back. Okay, it's not particularly friendly to grandpa. And if you have 50% plus damage, if there's a fire, or if there's a flood, or something like that, that damages the building that the use is in to 50% plus value, you can't resume it under your current code. That's not very good security for people that want to invest and reinvest in business, and we think it's not where you want to be. The current non-conforming structures, so you got non-conforming land uses, and then you have non-conforming structures that would be buildings and things like that. Also pretty tough on grandpa. You can't expand in a way that increases the non-conformity. You can't reconstruct a building if it's damaged more than 50%. You can't relocate it at all unless you relocate it in a fully conforming way. And you can't do ordinary repairs if the 5-year total cost exceeds 50% of the market value before the work began. Who's going to keep track of their receipts for 5 years? Goodness. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, in terms of, so that you can say to the county, look, I comply with this or I don't. That's very generous of you. You're a good citizen. I appreciate that. A lot of people won't do that. So under the current code, you've got a non-conforming use, which remarkably includes use, landscaping, parking, and lighting. So the use of your property, in fact, under this definition also includes your landscaping. Non-conforming structures are building structures and signs. That makes sense. And then non-conforming parcels of land. So under the new code, we treat things as to what they are. Non-conforming uses, non-conforming buildings, non-conforming structures, which generally have a lower value than the principal building, so they should be treated differently. Non-conforming site improvements is a parking space, a structure? Maybe. I don't know how you would interpret that. Non-conforming landscaping, because landscaping is qualitatively different from everything else. Non-conforming signs and non-conforming lots or parcels, which is kind of what you have now. How do we apply standards to non-conforming landscaping under the current code? Project landscaping doesn't generate traffic unless it's really, really well done. And I don't know if you can see this in the back, but this is really, really well done. It's a couple of dogs here. Pretty neat. So it's amazing what you can pull off the Google machine, right? So it doesn't generate traffic, yet the increase in traffic is a standard by which we would judge whether non-conforming landscaping could be expanded. How do you expand or contract? Don't we want to expand landscaping rather than contract it? I think we do. So we recognize the nonconformities for what they are. It's not realistic also to ask many landowners to bring their businesses, their institutions, their mixed-use projects where they are into full compliance just because they want to make a few improvements. If you want to do a facelift on your building, but your building is non-conforming, but it's not a really big deal, why shouldn't you be able to do that? Can anybody think of a principled reason why the county should say no?
Because they want to.
It's not a principled reason. Is there a principled reason why the county should say no? It's not relevant. The county should encourage people to invest in property. The new code would allow people to invest in property. improvements are good. If it takes you a while to bring a property into compliance, as long as the trajectory is good and the rules make sense, then we should agree that bringing it into compliance over time in steps that make economic sense is a good idea. The new code tries to get there. Now, to the extent that we can tweak it to make it better to get there, we'll do that. But that's the trajectory of it. That's the philosophy of it. That's where we're trying to go. No governmental purchase of property through eminent domain or threat of eminent domain should ever make the rest of the property non-conforming. I think that's sort of the existing situation, but we would carry that forward. How many lots of property? The 95 expansion? So would you then like to be told now your property is also non-conforming? Now, none of those people in the room, but we met with some of them yesterday, and of course they wouldn't. And of course they shouldn't be treated that way. They've done a great public service, increasing the size of that right. Well, they got compensated through eminent domain. I don't know whether they think that compensation is appropriate or not. It's up to the individual property owner to decide. There are two types of non-conforming uses. There's a major non-conforming use for which non-conforming use provisions were in the first place. That's the coal-fired power plant that's obsolete, that's in the middle of the residential neighborhood, that's dirtying up everybody else's lawn, and everybody else was there first and the coal-powered power plant came later. It's something big, a big deal, something with a lot of impact. And something that we haven't actually figured out what that would be yet, but we have a category for it. And there won't be any major non-conforming uses until you tell us what they are, or where they are, or what the scale is that makes something that bad. Yes, sir?
Railroad refueling depot.
Yeah, well, maybe that's it if it becomes non-conforming. I think philosophically we're trying to make things that are existing and functional that aren't creating huge problems for the neighbors right there, conforming by zoning them appropriately. But to the extent that it might be really, really in the wrong place, then that could be a potential deal. So in other words, the code will identify major if we can identify them. But for the most part, if you have a use that's non-conforming, and it's been there a long time, you should be able to find a way through a reasonably easy process to make it conforming, so that you don't have problems with lenders and expansion and stuff like that. And so we'll provide a way to do that. It's not, see, under the law, we can't do what's called a use variance, because it's not allowed. It's not authorized. But we can make things conforming that are not conforming through other processes, and that's what we'll do. Which means that if you have it now, we'll find a way to make sure that you can go through an easy process to recognize it as conforming, and you can show that to your lender when you want to do something with your business. Minor non-conforming uses could become conforming. Major non-conforming uses would be treated in much the same way that they are now, but that would be a very, very limited set of stuff that frankly we haven't figured out what it is yet. We count on you to tell us. And if we go through this whole process and don't find one, we don't really care that much. We're not trying to shut things down unless they're really, really bad. And we know that we want to be able to do anything we want, so it has to be really, really bad so everybody agrees. Non-conforming buildings and structures should be allowed to become conforming also through a degree of administrative flex. So in other words, if the setback line is at 10 feet, but my building was built at 9.5, 50 years ago, I should be able to just go to Scott and say, close enough is good enough. And Scott should be able to say, okay, well, I'm allowed 10% or whatever, and you follow. And I didn't do the math. I just said that on the fly, so you can correct me on the tape or whatever later. But you have the idea. Scott will have some percentage by which he can just say, okay, that's good. It's there. You don't need a variance to justify it after the fact. You're good. You're conforming.
The director of that point?
Well, what we'll do is we'll build in the math that says the director will just say yes at this point. And what you want, you normally in these circumstances, is some paper from the bank that says it's okay. So the county should be able to give you the paper, and that's what he'll do. That would be the idea behind it. And we can adjust the percentages, but we have some percentages proposed. I'm trying to give you the strategic level overview, but that's where it is. So, does anybody have any questions restricted to the idea of nonconformities at this point? If not, we'll proceed on into procedures. Sir?
Todd, you're just talking land uses, not structure at this
Well, I
point.
talked about both.
In other words, building code issues you're not addressing in the ULUC. If you had a non-conforming building code issue with, IBC or whatever, that is not through this process.
Totally outside of our scope.
So I just wanted that to be clear in case people,
Yeah, we're not hired to work on the building code, which is essentially, how far apart do your joists need to be spaced, and what does your foundation have to be composed of your electrical and plumbing. That's so far beyond my realm of expertise. I'm the guy who will say, where the setbacks are and what the procedures are and stuff like that. Where is the building situated on the ground and how big is it? That's what zoning does. Building codes do all the technical stuff. Building codes are there to make sure that your building is safe and fire resistant and all that other stuff. We're not doing that. So if it doesn't help, it's just because we're not doing that. Okay, so does anybody else have questions about nonconformity? Sir?
A comment and a question. The comment is I'm concerned about you making reference to this new plan as if it's already done and not under consideration for revisions. That's my comment. The question is, major non-conforming, it sounds like you're not planning on giving a definition, but it's going to be a living definition, which scares the hell out of me.
No. Okay, two things that I want to make sure I clarify. For your benefit, I will own it.
Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry if I miscommunicated this point. So the first thing is that, okay, the first question, or the second question, I'll take them out of order, and maybe I'll ask you to restate the first one. The second question is with respect to major non-conforming uses. And okay, the first question was, it sounds like you've already figured this out, and you're just telling us about it, and you're not changing it. Okay, so taking them in the order that I just presented. Major non-conforming uses, we just haven't figured out what in Kootenai County is so offensive where it's located that it's totally inappropriate for it to continue to be there, and when they leave, you don't want them to come back. So if you have suggestions on that, we'll put them in. If you don't, then it will be up to you and your county commissioners at a later date to create an ordinance to address it, because we won't. We'll treat everything minor. Right now, everything is treated major, and if you stop a non-conforming use, you can't start it up again. You can't become conforming. And we don't think that's right. So some of you probably have non-conforming uses now because of amendments over time to use tables and things like that. In the future, we wouldn't worry about that so much. You could become conforming by getting a piece of paper fairly easily instead of worrying about whether you're non-conforming. So there would be a process for that. The second issue with respect to whether this project is done, no, it's not done. And yes, we are inviting public comment. And yes, we are continuing to shape this as a result of that public comment. So when I asked you earlier, if you guys have any suggestions, we want those suggestions. It's up to the county commissioners to adopt a code. We're here to help write it. And while we're writing it, we want as much input as we can get. Sir?
Todd, I'm listening to you. So in the cities and urban areas and the suburbs, you're going to make it easier through conforming to non-conforming laws to do what you want with your property. But as you get out into the agricultural areas and the rural areas, you're going to become more restrictive in your uses through conforming to non-conforming laws.
The question was in the cities and suburbs, we'll make it easier, and in the rural areas, we won't. The first order of business to make sure in the cities, we have no jurisdiction. So there are areas that are kind of urban, like Bayview, where it's kind of like a city, but it's not. And it will be easier to do things with homes in established neighborhoods, which are typically, small lots like in Bayview, up to about 5 acres, 6, 7 acres for some of them. And beyond that, the regulations as far as individual homeowners are concerned are pretty permissive anyway, and we don't anticipate there being any difficulties with nonconformities because there's so much land that pushing the envelope on that will be difficult.
But as far as breaking up agricultural areas or rural areas, you're going to become more restrictive in those areas?
A little bit, potentially.
Finally, the truth.
No, let me explain that. This is a really important point. I'm sorry? I can't hear if there's sidebar.
How much is a little?
How much is a little?
Okay, it's different. It's different. Here's what the deal is with respect to what the proposal is. And again, the question is, are you going to be more restrictive in the rural areas? So how many have read what's allowed in the rural zone by conditional use? Okay, so you know that you could build a racetrack in the rural zone in the middle of a apartment community by conditional use.
I just am concerned what you're going to do to grandpa.
Yeah, okay, so existing uses, not more restrictive, less restrictive. So if you're non-conforming in the rural zone now, you'll have a pathway to be conforming, so you don't have to worry about it. You can continue to invest and grow that business as conforming use.
So what you're saying is yes, through conforming and non-conforming law changes, you're going to become more restrictive, as long as you fit within those conforming and non-conforming uses.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, we have currently a rural 5-acre zoning law.
Can I give you a microphone, because it's hard to hear up here?
Sure.
Oh, you got another one. Scott's got one. Maybe Scott, I'll try to. I can turn it off. I'll turn it off.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay. Currently we have rural 5-acre zoning pretty much throughout the rural areas of the county. It's my understanding the size, rural zonings like 10 acre, 20 acre. So like if you had like a 10 acre lot, if you had 19.9 acres, you'd have one building lot, and if you had a 20 acre zoning, if you had 39.9 acres, you'd have one building lot.
For a house, yes.
Thank you. You answered the question.
Okay, so,
I just want to make it clear to everybody what's happening.
sure.
Isn't the intent for 40 acres though? I mean, wouldn't it, if 39.9 acres was there, the intent obviously was 40 acres when it was split up, so.
Here's the thing, at those boundaries, this is where, variances shouldn't be granted what they are.
I was just trying to make it clear to everybody.
Sure, yeah, the idea of lower densities in the rural environment is in the code. And
But
it's
we're gonna overall become more restrictive and down zone those areas.
in residential density, the residential density of rural areas will be less than 1 unit per 5 acres under the proposed code. Yes.
So we are becoming more restrictive in rural and agricultural areas.
In terms of the use of property for existing uses, less restricted for permitting grandfathered uses to continue and be healthy. For farmers and foresters, making sure that the farming and forestry that's out there and healthy now isn't competing with subdivisions, because it's not good for farmers and foresters competing with subdivisions. So there are reasons for that are in your comprehensive plan. Now, many may be cynical about the comprehensive plan. That's okay.
So the answer is you are becoming more restrictive in the use of property in the rural and agricultural areas. And down zoning is going to be pretty much countywide, moving from 5 acre rural zoning to 10 acre, 20 acre type down zoning. And I just wanted to make it clear to everybody what's actually happening, because if you have 10 acres now with this new zoning, you'll need, and you have 19.9 acres, you have one building lot. If you have 20 acres and you have 39, or if you have 20 acres.
Not one building, one resident.
Yeah, one residence.
Right, not a building.
I want to make sure that people don't misunderstand, because zoning is not a simple task. If this job were simple and easy, we'd be done. So when you talk about are you going to be more restrictive or less restrictive, in the code, in the course of a zoning code, it depends on what you want to do. Honestly, if you want to operate a farm, you're going to be better off, because you're not going to, there's a lot of people in certain areas of the county that are very upset about residential subdivisions encroaching into their agricultural or forestry areas because they're disruptive. Is there anybody like that in this room now today? Okay, we've certainly heard that, and we see that that interest is represented. Secondly, in the comprehensive plan, and I know, again, there's some cynicism about that, and we'll talk about that in the second half, but it says we want rural areas to be rural. Now, 5 acre lots are really not rural. They're not operating farms or forestry in the way, even a forestry exemption requires about 6 acres to get, because 5 acres have to be trees. So we're not really talking about a rural landscape if you're accommodating a lot of 5 acre lots across the landscape. Second, really, really, really important point. If you live on a 5 acre lot today, you're not going to be zoned 20 or 40 acres tomorrow. You're going to be zoned EN, which means that as a homeowner, you'll be better off. So if the principal use of your 5 or 10 acres is residential, under the new code, you'll be better off in almost every circumstance. So we're not taking everything that's zoned rural today and turning it into 20 or 40 acre or even 10 acre zoning. A whole bunch of stuff that's zoned rural today will be zoned established neighborhoods in the future if the code is adopted. And again, it's not my call whether the code is adopted. I'm just trying to get it right. Okay? And I know there's going to be a lot of disagreement about it, and we can work with everybody that wants to work with us to try to get it calibrated properly. But the reality is that the landscape can't absorb, and you can't fiscally handle as a county 5 acre lots everywhere. It just won't work.
Well,
Why not?
My percentages are close, they're not right on, but approximately 82% of the state of Idaho is state and federal lands. So we're arguing about the last 18%.
Not in Kootenai County.
No, but it follows the same similar pattern.
You have a large swath of the eastern part of the county. That's state and federal land. And we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about that's related to things other than procedure at the end of this. So I do appreciate it. Any other questions about procedure? Because we do want to get through that. Okay, proceed, sir.
There's not enough hours in the day for this.
Amen.
people move in, the county said, well, they've got all of their permits.
Yeah, we're not,
Non-conformity.
if it's got permits, if it was allowed then and it's not allowed now, it's not conforming. If it was allowed then and it's allowed now, then it's conforming, it's not non-conforming.
Not allowed then, they went ahead and let them do it anyway.
Depending on how they did it, you know, that's, it may be allowed anyway because it may have had some other device that variance.
So on this, on zoning, in a prior meeting, somebody mentioned a 40-acre minimum parcel size, or to divide it to, so if you had 160 acres, you could make 4 40s. And somebody mentioned 20 acres in it, but you suggested that 40 acres be a minimum size. So if grandpa has 160 acres somewhere, are you saying that he could divide it into 40 acres minimum? And that should be the minimum parcel size of 40 acres?
No,
So if you have a 20, you couldn't make 2 10s? If you have a 40, you couldn't make 4 10s?
no, it's really not that simple because each district has its own requirements, so I can't generalize it.
So
We don't have the maps yet, but we're close and we'll release them. Right, I understand you need to see that, and I hope you're patient with us, and we met with a group of property owners up north on 95 last night, and this information helps us to develop a proposal, but we're working on that. This is a hard job, okay, and we're above board here, we're working on a map, and we're gonna workshop that map all across the county on a code, and I wanna see all of you at this workshop so you can see what it is that we did, and you should know
we'll
that
be
we
there.
do the best we can in a huge area to try to figure it out. And we're going to have mistakes on that map, and you're going to help us correct it by saying, you know, this is the circumstances here, and we'll draft that map interactively. So there's no agenda for the map other than to try to get it right. We have to start with something that you can react to. So,
On the comprehensive land use, there's a city, I've just been picked up there. And you've got the purple area, which is called transition. How is that going to be treated with the transition land? Are we going to make an urban map over the grass and dirt areas? Is it going to become an urban map? I mean, the zoning ordinance will affect that.
when transitions occur for small lots over the perimeter, those lots will be sewered because they'll be part of the city. So the transitional on the comprehensive plan relates to, it is anticipated that ultimately cities will grow and that will develop as city with sewer. That's what the comp plan says. The zoning map anticipates that in large measure through recognizing what's there now, which is principally in a lot of those areas either an established neighborhood, which is what it is and nobody's going to get in its way, or it's agriculture, or there's some mining and other things, there's some industry in various locations. And we're respecting what's there now and offering a little bit more flexibility in terms of smaller lots. So I want to make sure that we're staying on procedure until the last hour, because we do have to get through hearing procedures. How many came to talk about procedure?
He's 2 minutes.
A couple. So we do want to address it, because that's what was on our agenda. So if it's not directly about non-conformities, let's just hold it off for a minute. Yes, ma'am.
I just have one question. If I take my hard-earned money and I go buy 10 acres of land in rural Kootenai County, my kids want to come up and live with, build an extra house, I sell them an acre, that's not allowed.
It might be. You know, the maps will, what I'm saying is, look, the maps will create different rules in different districts. I don't know what the 10 acres is. I can't say that now, but I want you to come back and work with us on the map. And if we need to refine the zones, we need to refine the zones. But the reality is that a 5-acre lot pattern across the entire county is not rural. And it's not a thing that the county can fiscally sustain because it's too much investment. So the question is, there are locations in the county where that would work. Yes.
So I would need to get special permission to build my kids.
No, you would look at the map and you would say, where can I build 2 units on 10? That's, and that will be reasonably mapped. I mean, that's something that we need to work through. Yes, sir.
Okay, this is just me. This is just me.
No.
If you were 9.5 feet setback, or 10-foot setback from 9.5, all you would have to do under this new proposal would be to go and say, okay, I'm 9.5 feet, I want to conform. Is it okay? Now, what's the guarantee that they will let you do that?
The guarantee is that the code will say within X number of percentage, and all you would have to do is the math. The only reason, sir, that I would suggest that you want to have paper is because after the crash, banks are really skittish about lending. Are there any lenders in the room? Okay, then we can talk about that. Lender. Banks are skittish. They want the paper. They want to know that they have
I
security.
already own the property.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about that.
I already own it.
That's fine. We can adjust this to say that within X percentage, you are conforming automatically. I'm okay with that. I just think, if you're a lender, you want the paper. The one lender nodded his head. And if you want to get a loan on your property or refinance or pull equity out or whatever, you should have that ability. And we can provide paper that says, okay, we can do that in a variety of ways. And we can accommodate
The
that.
next question is like her question. I bought property 10 years ago, okay? With the plan of, if I want to build a house on my property for my kids, then I can do it. I can do it. I have a house, they can have a house. I want to let my kids live on the property with them. You're saying, under this new code, you can put one resident on that piece of property.
I'm not saying that.
That's what you said.
If you're in a 10-acre district, then yeah, but if you're not, then what I'm saying is,
I'm not in a 10-acre district right now.
no, I don't know. I don't know where you live. I don't know where your land is. I want you to come out when we bring the maps and help us figure this out.
You guys are changing the maps. You're changing the district.
Yes,
So
and
I
we
bought
want,
this property before, and now you're changing the district, so I'm going to be in that.
I want to own this. Again, deferring back to my new friend. I want there to be no misunderstanding about this.
No.
There are two pieces. There are two pieces to zoning. There are two pieces, not just one. Two pieces. One is a code that's a book that has a bunch of rules in it, right? And one is a map. And in order to figure out what part of that book applies, you got to look at the map. Now, the reason we write the code first is because everybody is altruistic when they're not looking at the map. And we can look at representative situations to try to figure out what should this code say. And we can do that with a high degree of confidence based on our experience. Now, at the end, we try to figure out what should that map be. And that's where people's self-interest comes into play for good reason, and we like that. That's important. But that's the appropriate time in the project. Now, it's frustrating that we're not there yet, but it's just where we are in time. I would like my birthday to be tomorrow so I can get presents and cake. My birthday isn't until next year. I have to wait. That's how it goes. We have a workflow. We're trying. We're trying to move it very quickly, but that's where we are. And we're getting towards the place where we can release a map with some comfort.
So to address this question, though, you have the land that you own that you wanted to put two houses on.
Right.
Today, in today's current zoning, you can't do it. You can only put one house on your property. You have to subdivide it to get the other property.
Couldn't you put a residence less than 1,000 or less?
An ACU, that's
There's
correct.
another structure, that's another
You will
residence.
still be able to do that under this new code, so you'll be able to do that.
Even easier, actually. We took away
Yeah,
some
so,
restriction.
but the same thing with the lady who asked the question. If I go buy 10 acres and I want to sell one to you can't do that today. So, we're looking at the codes today and manipulating or transitioning those into different and more easily usable and trying to make it less complicated than it is today. We're based on what is today, not what everybody wants or what they think that I should be able to do. Exactly what you said is if I want to build 10 houses on my thing, that's not what's happening and that's not what's allowed today. So, but we need to finish the hearing procedures and then the other questions. All of these questions will be addressed after we get done with those. So let's stick to the hearing procedures and the
We're just going through procedures and appeals, and we'll be done. And we don't have a very long presentation on this. And thank you, Commissioner, for pointing
Thank you,
that out.
it's been a whole hour.
Okay, so basically right now you're hearing commissioners, or you're hearing procedures. You've got big issues in your current code with respect to hearings. How many have participated in a public hearing in Kootenai County? Okay, as a proponent or as an opponent to development? Both? Some days, some another day? Okay. Now, there are too many public hearing permits with standards that are hard to consistently administer now. The rural zone is replete with non-rural uses that can be approved by conditional use permit with very few, if any, standards. So that's fine if you want to have those uses in the landscape, but then the zone shouldn't be called rural because it's not. It's just not. It's not descriptive of what it is. And if you don't want to have rural, then you shouldn't have rural. Yes, sir.
Does the county have a definition of urban versus rural, and is there something in between? Because I don't live in an urban area, I live out in the Garwood area, and it's not urban, it's rural.
Right.
You don't like that definition, so what?
We will talk after about what's rural.
No, I think there's enough people in here need to know that.
Sir, I've got a direction from the county commission to finish my presentation here and address all the concerns afterwards. And I said it was short. So basically, there are a lot of public hearing permits with standards that are hard to consistently administer. If you're a proponent or an opponent to projects over time, you probably have been frustrated by interpreting those standards and figuring out how to advocate for or against the project. The hearing procedures are problematic because things are changing along the way, because hearing examiners are hearing and finding facts and making recommendations on paper to a body that then makes the decision without looking people in the eye, without having to have been there for the hearing to understand what actually happened there. And there is no comprehensive review of a development until very late in the process, until after all the engineering about earthmoving and all that is done. That's when we show what the site is going to look like. For a developer who's making investments in planning, that's a very, very difficult burden in terms of risk. And minor subdivisions are way too narrowly defined. They're up to 4 lots and no infrastructure at all. So like shared driveways, you're into a subdivision process that requires hearings when you shouldn't have to do that. Full hearings are conducted right now by a hearing examiner. The full public hearing, they find facts and all that, and then they make a recommendation. Now, if you're trying to get something done, why would you want to finish that process that's very much like going to court and not get a decision from that process? You then have to transmit all that information up to somebody else who makes the call. Now, as a guy who practiced law, I wouldn't want to argue to a judge and then have another judge decide the case, but that's what you're doing now. And it doesn't make any sense to me. If it makes sense to anybody, I want to talk to you about it afterwards and try to explain to you how bad it is, and if you can convince me otherwise, great. I'm not going to recommend that you continue doing what you're doing now. And if you want to preserve it, we can talk about it. Appeals of decisions from the director, which is basically the department, because the director will delegate to his staff the decision on some of the stuff, are appealed to a hearing examiner, but the decisions on appeals, but the decisions are actually done by the Board of County Commissioners. So if Scott's department does something that you don't agree with, you have to, again, have it heard by a hearing examiner who then tells somebody else to decide. So that you get to have a hearing, but you don't have it in front of the actual decision maker. It doesn't make any sense. Many decisions by a staff or the hearing examiner of the new code create a potential for faster approvals. Fewer public hearings and hearings by decision makers. In other words, if you're going to hear the facts and find them, you should also make the call. And if somebody's dissatisfied with that decision, then they appeal it, and the county commission hears it again, and they look the witnesses in the eyes, and they determine credibility and figure all that stuff out just like a judge would, just like you would expect a decision maker to do in a fair hearing, that your decision maker is impartial and they get to not only look at the evidence, but weigh it. A larger notice radius in rural areas, right now 300 feet is the required notice radius. So if you want to do something that requires a public notice, like a rezoning or whatever, then 300 feet out from the property lines is all you have to do in terms of sending mail out about what's going to happen. Now, in the rural environment, 300 feet doesn't go very far. It might be 1 or 2 or 3 property owners. Sometimes the county tries to figure out if the same owner owns that other piece, and then they go beyond that, but you can't always tell. And if you incorporate something in Delaware, I don't know whether you're the same owner. You could split that up easily enough. So the larger notice area would mean that at least 20 people will get notice by mail. And if you get to more than 200, you don't have to have the expense. Now, how many people go and collect their certified mail all the time and are excited to open it? In 2012, nobody. Okay, certified mail means you're getting served, right? So the certified mail requirement for mail notice would go away. Mail notice would become much cheaper to do. You'd get it first class mail. The county would mail it out so that we know that the mail went out. You get notice of the application for which notice is required when the application is complete. It goes out. You can come look at the record if you want to. So that's how the public can get involved earlier if they want to. They don't have to. And then you get another notice if there's a public hearing as required by state law. So for public hearings, you get 2 notices. If there's 2 public hearings, you get 3 notices. Applications are filed, public hearing 1, public hearing 2. Those are for rezonings where the state requires 2 public hearings. So early notice of the application and a standardized approval process. Right now you have different approval processes and different ordinances. There should just be one set of hoops. People should know predictably what set of hoops they have to go through. So this is what the hoops look like, and it's really not as bad as all this. For big stuff, big major subdivisions, a certain number of lots that create bigger impacts, you come in, you talk to the department, this is conceptually what I want to do. The department tries to help you because the code will be new, there'll be some education, some learning curve, the department will help you through and say, these are the forms and this is what the process looks like, this is how these things schedule out. Then you go and you get your stuff together, you file an application. You can do a pre-application for anything you want, but there are certain things for which big things would be a requirement. Then you file your application, the county then would review it, is it complete? In other words, are all the forms there, is the review fee and all the stuff in place? And then they would and within a couple of days, they'd look at it again, and they'd look through it in more detail, so they can tell you it's complete right away. If it's not, they'll hand it back and say, you need the X and Y to complete this application, so we can legitimately process it. Beyond that, there are certain applications that come in where all the papers are there, but the papers are unreadable, or the papers don't have the proper information, or they're not, if you have a survey, the survey doesn't close, or there's some big problem that you can't figure out whether the thing complies or not, that would be a sufficiency review. Is this sufficient for us to figure out whether this thing complies with code or not? So beyond that, so those are two ways that the application could be revised to make sure that it can actually be looked at. I mean, in all fairness, the county staff shouldn't have to guess at what the applicant's trying to do. They should be able to say, okay, we need some revision to make sure we can process it. After it's sufficient, it's reviewed promptly. It goes out, if it needs public notice, there are certain things that need public notice. There's a public notice and the public can review the application and provide comments back. The county doesn't have all that much jurisdiction over a lot of things. Panhandle Health gets referrals. In certain instances, cities are due referrals. There are other jurisdictions that might have a referral where they provide expertise and comment. So it goes out to agencies like it does now, and then it comes back with comment. After that, for most things that people want to do, there would be a written decision. You complied with the code, here you go. Now, along the way, staff wants to be helpful. So they'll say, in response to this comment, these neighborhood comments, and our review, here's what you need to do to give us an application we can approve. So we don't want pathways to know. How many have opposed the project again? Did you win? Okay, if you won, then what happened to the land? It remained vacant, waiting for the next application to oppose? Still proceeding. Okay, so if you win when you're opposing a process, that means that you have to then fight that battle another day, which isn't really a win. Everybody loses having to set up the next fight. If you have a code that says what it is that's going to happen, then you want to provide ways to yes, and the best way to know the future of a property is to approve a development and have it built. And if it's low impact because that area can't handle high impact, then it's low impact, but we know if we build a house it's going to last about 100 years. And if we build a shopping mall, 20 to 30 years, and maybe more depending on the shopping mall, before somebody will come in and scrape it and do something else because the investment comes to do that. So the best way to lock down what a property is to have the property owner do what they want. So if you're an opponent, if you're a regular opponent to projects, it means your code is broken. It's not doing what the community wants. You shouldn't have to fight all the time. And if you're a proponent, you should be able to do something that you want, that's also good and responsible. And that's really what codes are about. And by good and responsible is not what Todd thinks is good and responsible. It's what the community through the zoning code decides is good and responsible, which is a wide variety of stuff. And if you look through this code, you'll see that. So in many things, this basic process would also get on to a recommendation. So the administrative process reviews it. There's a recommendation. We start, this is mostly for public hearings, start process. We go through complete, sufficient. We talked about this stuff. So here's my gratuitous animation for the night. Okay, so the bigger decisions go to a recommendation so that you get a public hearing. So the basic process is the slide that you just saw, and you move to notices. So once the recommendation is in place, the staff sets it on the agenda, the next available agenda of whatever body hears it next, which for most things would be the hearing examiner. So the hearing examiner is scheduled, the statutes require notice, the notice is issued. It may be mail notice, posted notice, it may be published notice in the newspaper, some combination thereof. The legislature has given us guidance on that point, it's detailed. But radius is expanded, generally speaking, beyond 300 feet, and we have better specifications for posted notice. How many people notice the posted notices that they have now? They're paper, and they're small. And in the wintertime, they blow down, and they get wet, and you can't see them. So we're talking about is a 24 by 36, probably chloroplast. Does anybody know chloroplast? It's like a corrugated plastic, cheap, but very resilient to weather. You'll be able to see the posted notices now, and then get some more information. Beyond that, after the notice period, you'll have a public hearing. That would flow according to a procedural resolution. Let's just say we've tried to address issues of due process and make things better in the proceeding than they are now. And that would go mostly to a hearing examiner for a written decision. Now, for those things like rezonings where the statutes require the Planning Commission to make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners, we can't tell the legislature that we're not going to do what the legislature said. At those stages, Planning Commission would make a recommendation, and then you go through this process again to a second public hearing, down to a written decision that would almost always be by the Board of County Commissioners, with very few exceptions for things that nobody's probably going to do, and in fact, we might end up deleting that stuff anyway. So, appeals. Appeals are, I got a decision, I didn't like the decision. Either I was the applicant or I was a substantially affected neighbor. The decision was faulty for some reason. I need to appeal it. I don't have to go to court right away. The appeal comes from a staff decision. Currently it goes to a hearing officer but is decided by the board. That doesn't make sense from a process standpoint. Those appeals would be actually decided by the hearing officer under the proposal. And then appeals from hearing officers would go to the county commission. So if you had something that the hearing officer decided, which are currently all those things of hearing examiners. I said officer, I mean examiner at Kootenai County. If you have something now that hearing examiners are making a recommendation on, if the code is adopted as proposed in terms of process next year, it would be a hearing examiner actually making a decision on. If that's not right, the county commission would hear it, and the county commission would be able to find its own facts. So basically, the body that hears the appeal should decide the appeal. In all fairness, would you want to go to a judge and present a case and have somebody else decide?
I wouldn't trust the judge.
Anybody want to do that? How can you do that? How could you, as a decision maker, be confronted with that? How do you weigh the evidence if you can't see the witnesses? Does anybody have a principled reason why we would do that? Sir?
I just have a question about the person who decides right now is the county commissioners on the projects. And they're elected by the people.
Yes.
So sometimes, some things are approved and are approved, and a lot of people have alarms about it and have an election, and we have new commissioners. So,
yes.
So the way you have it set up, it seems to me that they're far removed from the decision-making process to the very end. And a lot of people in between who are not elected are making really important decisions about land use, which you're saying will flow from the understanding of the code, which comprehends all these things. But it seems like when you take away the people facing election, having them making all the decisions, you're taking away some of the power of the people to have an influence on land use.
I understand. Let me give you the constitutional logic behind why we do it this way and recommend it this way. And if that logic fails, we can always upgrade all these decisions to public hearings and to the Board of County Commissioners. But let me make the case, because I think the case is compelling. And that is, if I have a broken code that nobody can understand, how am I going to hold people accountable? And the answer is, I'm going to hold people accountable through elections. Because the individual applications are going to be where we figure out what the rules are. And that's why right now, if you have the existing code with no changes, you should be very nervous about pushing things away from the county commission. Because there is no accountability if there are no clear rules. Now, under a new code with clear rules, the idea is if the rules are clear, then the game should be played faster. And that shouldn't be so much discretion involved that we would worry terribly much about political accountability, except for making sure that the rules are right. So the most important legacy would be creating a fair set of rules that are easy to follow, that create a lot of ways to get from idea to yes, instead of from idea to some unaccountable person to no. So if we change our approach to how we regulate from 600 ways to say no, and one way to say yes that only one person knows what that way is and can decide, to there are 600 ways to yes and very few ways to no, because the county is there to help get to yes by saying here are the different pathways, and they're as clear as we can make them. Then the accountability is in the code itself. Now, if I'm an applicant, if I want to do something and I have to go to a public hearing, I don't know what the rules are, yeah, I might want to be able to do it politically. Not everybody has that strength. So codes like that, that necessarily depend on political decision-making, favor people who are politically connected and politically or charismatic or participate well in public hearings. But what it should do is favor the merits of the application itself. So right now, and this is alarming to me, and I'll bring it up because I think it illustrates this point. When you go to a public hearing, you can sign in, and you can say, I'm opposed, I'm neutral, or I'm for this project. And you don't have to speak. So there's a vote on that. Now I know if I say democratic process, some of you will get your backs up because we're in a republic. If I have rules and I'm supposed to be treated fairly as an applicant, then democracy doesn't apply when the rules are being applied to me. Democracy or Republican government needs to decide what the rules are, and then I need to be treated fairly like everybody else. And it shouldn't matter whether I'm charismatic or whether I'm a scoundrel. If I comply with the rules, I should get what I want. There should be no voting. It's not up to somebody who's not on the Planning and Zoning Commission, the Board of County Commissioners, or the hearing examiner whether I get what I want, unless they can point out why I don't comply with the rules. We can't vote on people's livelihoods. We don't do that in America. That's not how it works. We set the rules, and people comply with the rules. They should be able to get what they're entitled to by complying with the rules. Otherwise, why do we have rules? So that we would change. We don't think that's a good idea. If you're for it, speak to it. Give facts. People want decisions made on facts. And I can tell you from having litigated up and down state and federal appellate courts on due process, decision-making on individual property needs to be done based on facts and how those facts tie into standards, just like it would be in court. So that's very, very important. Yes, ma'am?
You got a half an hour.
No. If you want to hire, the question was if you go to an appeal or a hearing, do you need an attorney? And the answer is no. There is no requirement that you have an attorney, and there shouldn't be any need for you to have an attorney. Now, if you want to have an attorney, you have a right to counsel. You can bring an attorney to the hearing if you want to. If you want to get your neighbors together and have that expense, you can have that attorney participate as your spokesperson if you want to. And if you want to lodge a sophisticated attack against an application, you have a right to participate that includes counsel. But you don't have to do that. And you shouldn't have to do that. We shouldn't be fighting about it when people are out trying to comply with the rules. If the rules are clear, then that fight should have been about what the rules are. You know, if I have 2 board games I can play, if we decide on what board game, then darn it, we should follow the rules of that game and not try to make them up as we go along. I have young children, so I know how young children do that. Responsible adults shouldn't do that. Okay? We don't change the rules just because we don't like the outcomes on the fly. We change the rules and we take the risk that once in a while something will come out of those rules that we don't like. That's happened, right? How many have a project that's their favorite project to hate? Oh, come on, you're all lying. Some of you have that project. You can point it out. Anybody live down Highway 95 south of here? I bet you have some favorite projects that you love to hate. I bet you do. Anybody live in Bayview? I bet you have a project that you love to hate. I'm sure you could pick one out in any location in the county. Now, should the rules have allowed that? Maybe. Maybe it's just going to be the project that you love to hate. But if it's really, really bad, the rules shouldn't have allowed that in the first place, and the battle should have been about the rules. That's how we're fair. That's how law should operate. And I would venture to say, I'll go out on a limb here, that's what our founding fathers wanted. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, that's what it's about. It's not about the heavy hand of government. It's about the arbitrary hand of the King of England coming into people's houses and disrupting reasonable people from making a reasonable law. Read it carefully from start to finish. It goes well beyond the first paragraph. Yes, sir?
Let's open to
In
questions.
response to your description of the rule thing, it
Yes, sir.
sounds like you're describing a set of rules which are so crystal clear that almost anybody could look at them and look at an application and know what it is. But I think in reality, there's going to be a lot of interpretation. That once the rules are set and the code is developed, and the hearing examiner looks at the application, looks at all the recommendations, looks at all the approvals and the conforming of the proper way to do it, we're sort of going to have to interpret the meaning of the code as applied to that particular application. And that's where that kind of flexible gray area can generate a lot of disagreement and a lot of confusion. Unless those rules are so clear that anybody can interpret it, in that case, you don't need a hybrid zone. You just kind of arbitrarily have volunteers take the role of doing it once a month or something.
What the question was, for those who didn't hear it, if your rules are crystal clear, then you don't need a hearing examiner. You could have volunteers figure out compliance, and everybody would know what's going on. But the reality is that there's going to have to be some, I would call it discretion, I think you called it interpretation, about what the rules will mean in a particular circumstance. And the answer to that is yes. Right now, it's virtually infinite in a lot of cases. That's what we would call discretion, to the level that some people would call it subjectivity. Okay? That's not good. Some professional judgment where reasonable people will come to the same conclusion 9 times out of 10, that's going to have to be. And that's why we have public hearings. So if you, and here I'm pointing at a slide that's not there anymore, but if you have a permitted use, then the standard should be clear enough that staff can turn it around in a day or two. And if you have something that is more discretionary than that, that means the standards are more qualitative. And how do we do that? We have a public hearing where people can contribute that qualitative information, and people can make an interpretation based on facts. Now, judges are called upon to do this all the time, right? And so we have a process for that that involves the public. And the more definite the standards, the fewer the procedures that you need. The less definite the standards, the more the procedures that you need. And that way you get to process across the board. In general, we're providing more specifics so that we don't need to run people through hoops. But there are certain places in Kootenai County, and you all know, that are really challenging landscapes. And in those areas, you have a little bit more flex, and when you're going to exercise that flex, you need a little bit more process. But not to the extent that you have it now, where two things are happening. The first thing is that the people that are making the decisions aren't conducting the hearing. And the second thing is that the standards are so indefinite in some cases, or so internally inconsistent, that you couldn't possibly have reasonable people in the same room making the same decision all the time. So, somebody was just handing the mic, so I'm going to...
Yeah, your preparation and presentation is immaculate. I have to give you, kudos. You're excellent. I point out to you, by virtue of the history of what has gone on, not only in this county, but throughout the Republic, I was asked, what difference does it make, considering the Hegelian synthesis and the Agenda 21 ultimate end game that is occurring presently? There is no difference. We've been subjected to an hour-and-a-half presentation, very well done. Has everything to do with private property retention, not anything to do with adjudicating anything, but ultimately retention, considering what's going on with LIBOR and the banking industry. I don't think we really understand and appreciate the implications of what you're describing, considering the Administrative Procedures Act, 1946. And it has everything to do with private property, nothing to do with a constitutional republic, everything to do with democracy, of democracy that ultimately pretends tyranny. That's what's going on here. And I can't ask you folks sincerely enough, and yourself as well, to look up the Administrative Procedures Act. Study it closely, if not the Hegelian synthesis, and appreciate what these people psychologically and emotionally are being put through. It's a sincere request. You can copy it on republicbroadcasting.org. Be very, very well to study the issue closely, because it comes close to sedition and our treason. The fact that the sheriff is not here asking some people to recant and go with them is an amazement for me. But then nonetheless, with what's going on, I'm not surprised. Okay.
Thank you for the comment.
Simple question. My name is William Spring. I'll skip the microphone. Some of you may know my name. Recently, oh, that's cool. Recently, I sent a letter to the editor, but it's not. Does this work? Can you hear me now? Okay. Sent a letter to the editor just to publish it because I was kind of upset. I got a call back from the Berlin Press editor. He said, when we run this under my turn, which is kind of your editorial outreach column, and it was specific to my situation with a lot, and this is going to end up with a question for Mr. Messenger.
Hold the mic on your chin.
Okay, this is going to end up with a question for Mr. Messenger when I'm done. But observations I have, first of all, this thing is a moving target that we're all wasting our time here today on. Third revision, under the first one, which I'm told, and if this is true, it's unbelievable, that our county commissioners were prepared to sign. My lot on Waverly Loop, I'm going to do this as a specific instead of glittering generalities and glib comments. My lot, subdivision 20-plus years ago, would not even be a lot under the first revision because it wasn't big enough. I'm in a lot envelope property on Hayden Lake. Okay? So the first moving target was quickly revised, and that revision said, well, if you're an existing lot, then you're still a lot. Thank you very much. Part of what we're looking at here tonight is we're being asked to opine on an incomplete document. And Mr. Messenger just told you why. Because it's too hard to pass it if they give you the document and the zoning plan, because then everybody knows how it affects them. I don't even know 10 new codes. I don't know where my lot is. Does anybody know what the plan looks like so we can see this document along with a use code? So it's kind of meaningless. It's a waste of time. This needs to be presented all in one. And I'm going to assume, for Mr. Messenger's purpose, that my lot is in the EN district. Existing neighborhood, 20-plus year old, approved by the county, 80% build out, as I said in my newspaper, a little article that they picked up. All of my neighbors are built next to me. There are 4 of us who are not. I'm on a sloped lot. 3 years ago, the county took all of our fees requested to put in septic at no small expense. That's called an estoppel issue for your lawyers in the audience. Okay? As I read this document, I can't tell you if I'm grandfathered or not. I don't know if I'm in the EN code. I'm on a 30-degree slope, as are my neighbors who built right next to me 3 years ago. Okay? The point is, and I would ask you, Mr. Messenger, I'm a classic Lucas, and the county commissioners gave a perfunctory response about takings, and I've litigated takings issues.
As have I.
Okay, good. My lot under the last run-through of this one basically would be a complete taking. I'm a lot envelope, I'm 100 feet back on a 30% slope, as are my neighbors, and the last version of this moving target with no attached zoning plan or map. You absolutely have to have a plan, a zoning map to consider this. Mr. Messenger alluded to you can't pass it if you show him the map. He's telling you everything right there, isn't he? If you present it in one, there'll be resistance, because you now will know exactly where you sit in this deal. But Mr. Messenger, could you tell me, under what I've seen so far, how this won't constitute a taking of mine and my neighbor's lots? Because we will not be able to build unless we're in the existing neighborhood district, except the EN district only applies to lots and districts formed after the effective date. So if I'm in an EN district, that's footnote 3 in here. If I'm in an EN district, is my building, not my building code, but my land development code pre-existing? Because the EN district, if I'm in it, only applies to get lots and subdivisions after the effective date of this document. So where are we?
I appreciate you coming out tonight, and by way of context, we had I think it was a teleconference where you raised this question with me originally. And at that time, I attempted to clarify what the EN district does. And I apologize if I wasn't able to communicate properly to you. I'll own this for my new friend, what it does. Now, the EN district protects you. And if you're around Hayden Lake, I believe that is going, anything that's really 5 acres or less with houses on it is going to be EN under the proposed map. So if you have 5 acres or less and you live in what effectively is a neighborhood, count on it, okay? It's gonna be easier for you to make improvements to your land, and the provisions that you're talking about, that you would say are a taking, would not apply to your property. What the footnote 3 in that table says, and what the table is if you're doing a new subdivision, how the resource protection applies. It's for developers of subdivisions. And if you're in an EN zone, there's nothing that says that you can't do a subdivision if you have enough property. It's okay. But that, typically speaking, EN zones will be rather stable because they are rather stable now. Okay? So the subdivision rules would apply if you're going to subdivide your land after the effective date. That's all that that table does. That's what that footnote is that if you are going to do a new subdivision on your land in an EN zone, that you are not any longer exempt in terms of protecting resources for the subdivision. On your individual lot, you have very few restrictions in terms of resource protection that may ultimately constitute taking. Now, we don't want to have takings. I practiced law for 6 years, and I litigated takings. I understand Lucas and Nolan and Dolan, and for you lawyers in the room, any other land use lawyers in the room? Condolences if there are. I'm a recovering land use attorney myself. Lucas isn't the latest word on takings, but it's certainly good law. And what Lucas says is if you take away all economically viable use of property, it's a taking. What Lucas did was suggested that takings law is alive and well and killed it at the same time. What we worry about when we create a set of regulations is it a good idea? And if it is a good idea, is it going to hurt anybody? Because we don't want to hurt people to implement good ideas. Good ideas create benefit. So wait, before you begin, your existing lot will be protected, and there is no one that has an existing building right that will lose that building right under this new code. A single-family residence under Lucas, the Justice Scalia suggested that a single-family residence isn't a nuisance in an environment where everyone else has one too. Ironically, in Lucas, which had to do with building on the beach in a hurricane-prone area, and the city said you can't build so close to the water, or the South Carolina Coastal Council said you can't build so close to the water. Does anybody know the aftermath of that decision, what actually happened? Yeah. The house blew down in a hurricane. And you know what they did then? They sued the government because their house blew down. And you know what happened then? They won. So the government said no. The court said that's a taking. You got to allow it. They did. They built the house and it blew down and they sued and they won. Hey, that's American law. That's okay. I'm okay with that. Judges will do what they do, and I submit.
With doing the land use code map in conjunction with these regulations, so all these people know what the deal really is.
Heck yeah! We're going to workshop the map in October, as I said earlier. Okay. Now, I got to tell you, I'm serious when I say we did not come in here with a prescription. I don't come in here with a little bottle that has all the regulations in it and a map to boot. It's not like Cracker Jacks with a prize and some, special sweet ingredients. I got to do the work of writing this stuff and getting it right. If I map it first, I'm compounding my work geometrically just to get to a place where I can deliver something you can use. Now, I don't have the budget for that. I don't have the patience for that. There aren't enough hours in the day. So what we have to do is write the code and then write the map. We are at a stage right now where we're writing a map that you can react to, because we shouldn't do that from scratch. We shouldn't come out and say, okay, everybody, we got 34,000 parcels here. What do you think? We're hired to do that, to start. And when we workshop it, we will take everything under serious advisement about what these zones should say. Most of you will be happy. Yes, sir.
Revised, and the land use code, will there be another public hearing when everybody concretely knows what the map looks like, along with the latest stats?
Yes, I have no power to adopt a code for the county and impose it upon them. There are county commissioners that have to decide, and there are required public hearings under Idaho law. And the county commissioners have scheduled the project so that there will be a cooling off period, if you will, where the thing can sit on the window and you all can smell it. And if it passes the smell test, great. If it needs further revisions, we want to get it right. Do you know how I get work to feed my family?
By bullshitting people about
well, that was perfectly timed. Hold on a second. I do
make everybody happy, but I try to do the best work that I can. Yes, sir.
I just have a question. You said you were out 95 North yesterday and talking to landowners. How far north did you go?
We went to the mill for a neighborhood meeting. We've scheduled neighborhood meetings around the county on request throughout the course of the project. And so we talked to...
How far north did you go?
To the sawmill.
Have you gone north of that yet?
We were in Athol at the beginning of the project. We've been to Bayview to talk to property owners in Bayview. We've been in Michael Flats. We've been on the east side. We've talked to property owners around the county with a variety of different...
Some of us in Athol are concerned about the zoning with the new highway going in. Is there information on what you guys have found out anywhere that we can look at?
Like I said, the zoning maps will be workshopped all around the county in October. And so we're working on those maps. We want to make sure that our first draft is confident. And there are thousands and thousands of parcels of land in the county, so it's a lot of work.
So the maps will be done, and nobody will get to say so once the maps are done?
No.
Okay.
We're going to workshop the maps so you can look at us and look at them and tell us whether you think they're good. And if you have had a rezoning in the last 4 years, how many of you know that that's a property right? That rezoning decision is a property right under Idaho code for 4 years. So if you've got a rezoning on property in the last 4 years, this project doesn't affect you until that 4-year period runs. It doesn't, and we'll put stars on the map to show you where those are. So there's a bunch of property outside of Athol that was zoned commercial in the last 4 years. That property will remain not just commercial under the new code, but commercial under the old code for 4 years, because that's the right that you earned by getting it rezoned. Yes, sir.
I live in Athol too, or outside Athol. And in the neighborhood that we live in, there is 10-acre parcels, 5-acre parcels, and 20-acre parcels. And then there's a bunch of property that has been subdivided for several years. So what happens to that is one question. I mean, you know, how can you be in a 10-acre zone when there's 20 acres and 5-acre parcels all around you too? And then the next question is if you live on a private road, is the county going to help you with your road as far as the aesthetics of your property, because somebody driving down a private road didn't like the landscaping you have out there in front of your house?
There aren't any landscaping requirements for single-family homeowners in the code. We're not worried about private roads, and the county doesn't have any investment intentions in private roads that I know of, but the zoning code doesn't go to that. That's not part of what it is that we're doing. And again, landscaping requirements currently are applied to non-residential stuff, commercial property principally. There are landscaping requirements in the code. We're changing them because they don't make any sense. We talked about that last time we were out. The tapes, I don't know if there are tapes. Basically, it's too dense, it's too close to the building, and it's a fire hazard. So we're changing it to something that actually does make sense in terms of non-residential. But for single-family homeowners, do what you want. Do what you want. If you want to make your front yard pretty and increase the value of your house, do it. If you don't, then don't.
Can I add to that? What happens when these new codes pass? Because we all know that they're going to be passed. So what happens when that code doesn't meet what they really intended it for it to meet? So then they're going to put an amendment on that, and then they're going to amend that, and then they're going to keep amending, and then it's going to be right back to where we're at now. Because you're saying that we can't understand these because there's been so many amendments to it.
Yes.
So what's going to stop them from amending all these new codes?
Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's the beauty of our republic. When we need to change our laws, we do. And in fact, the beauty of it is that we can be smart enough as elected officials and electors of elected officials to know when it's gotten to the point where we need to euthanize it and start over again. And that's where you are now with your land development ordinances. And that's why we're here, is because we rewrite codes. It's all we do. Well, I mean, it's not. It's all I do. We have here people that do other stuff.
It seems to me that there's a principle at work here. There are broken rules, and I understand and we all understand there are rules that need to be clarified. But clarifying rules and changing the rules in the middle of the game are two different things. Changing the rules in the middle of the game are infringing on our property rights. And when people here bought property under certain rules, say we bought property that could be divided into 5s, and then all of a sudden you tell us we can only divide into 20s, that's changing the rules in the middle of the game and infringing on our property rights.
So the question is, if we bought property understanding the rules to be 5-acre subdivisions, and you change the rules in the middle of the game, you're infringing upon our property rights, and clarifying the rules is one thing, but changing the rules is another.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay. It raises two issues. One is that when you go to clarify the rules in 30 disparate ordinances that conflict with each other, where the rules are unclear as to what even the intentions are in some cases, it's literally impossible to clarify without saying this patient is past the point. When you do that, if you boil out what is the wisdom of the code, you find that in terms of the county, and there are a lot of people that have a differing view, but I think that the comprehensive plan says that we want to have the rural areas rural. And if we have a 5-acre lotting pattern across that landscape where there isn't the 5-acre lotting pattern now, if we assume that the average rural house generates half of what the average suburban house does in traffic, it's 5 trips per day on the road. It changes the whole character of the area when you have all of it become 5 acres.
That's not the point at all. The point is that we bought property with the understanding of what we were buying.
Right. The second is part 2.
We're buying something that we can do a certain thing with, whether we do it now or 25 years down the road or 5 years down the road.
Right.
And the government doesn't have the right to change those rules in the middle of the game after we plunked our money down and bought the property under certain provisions. And so it isn't a matter of clarifying anything. It was really clear to us what the rules were when we bought the property. And so it's one thing to clarify the rules, but it's another thing to change them.
Okay, so what I understand is you're reiterating the second point with that.
If you want to change things like that, then grandfather us in and have the changes happen when the next person buys the property from us. You know, and have it changed when the property changes hands, then you can change it, but it isn't fair to people who bought property under really clear rules to change the rules in the middle of the game.
So
it's stepping on our property rights.
Yes.
Never mind. If you bought the property 20 years ago, the rules have already changed. I will tell you that right now. If you work within Kootenai County.
Can we pass the microphone? I'm sorry, I can't hear you, so I just want to. I restated the question, which is you can't change the rules in the middle of the game. I have a property right at stake.
What happened to procedure?
And what I'm saying is that if you bought it 20 years ago, it's already changed in Kootenai County. If you work within Kootenai County and you try to divide property, like what you might be trying to do, it is almost impossible. If you go to the county and you approach the counter, they say no. That's what they do. They don't say, what are you doing? What's your application? How can I help you? They say no. And so what you have to do is present all the reasons why it should be yes. And so, and by the way, I'm Laura Morton from Rocky Mountain Architecture. I worked in Kootenai County doing projects for about 15 years with our company. Kootenai County needs this desperately. They need these codes not clarified. They've clarified them 10 times. They need them rewritten so they are prescriptive.
I'm not saying that certain things don't need to be changed, because there does need to be some clarifications.
But if you bought that property 20 years ago,
I did not.
Wait, if you bought the property whenever you bought it, you should do what you think you can do right then, because it's going to change.
Let me just say, we, as a recovering land use attorney, I will say that there are property rights that people expect, and there are property rights that courts enforce. And no court in the land has ever enforced a property right to existing rules of any type, whether it be the tax code. I had an expectation that I would pay 13% taxes, but the tax code changed.